Welcome to See Crime Stories, true stories of the missing and the pursuit of answers. In Holtville, Alabama, the start of summer 2017 looks ordinary on paper: long weekend, quiet roads, a family at home. Then it breaks. A mother and her teenage son vanish at the start of summer. No phone pings. No bank use. A freshly painted house, new cameras, a burned pile, and traces that don't add up. 8 years on, Alabama investigators still want the one answer that closes every other question: where are Susan and Evan? This case begins with timestamps, not rumors. Memorial Day, May 29, 2017. 42-year-old Susan Osborne and her 14-year-old son Evan Chartrand are last reliably placed at their residence in the Holtville/Wetumpka area of Elmore County. No recorded travel reservations. No outgoing calls or text activity that forms a pattern. No debit or credit transactions after that date. In missing person work, silence is data. Here, the silence is total. Friends and extended family try the usual routes: calls, messages, drive-bys when they can. Nothing changes the dashboard: phones muted, accounts static. Investigators later confirm what relatives already suspect: there is no sign either of them prepared a voluntary move. School obligations, routine payments, and basic communication stop at once. That kind of cutoff is an investigative red flag, particularly for a parent with a minor child. The first anchor of this chapter is the absence itself. When adults leave voluntarily, a trail tends to form: cash withdrawals, fuel purchases, at least a small digital wake. When parents leave with a child, the trail is usually larger: logistics, food, lodging. By contrast, the record here is blank. No 911 call is logged to launch the case. Instead, a slow, uneasy interval passes while those outside the home try to reach them. Weeks later, with no contact at all, the family files the missing person report. That delay will matter to detectives, not because it proves anything on its own, but because it defines a window in which unrecorded events can occur and be cleaned over. This is a domestic context disappearance. That phrase does not appoint guilt, but it narrows focus. The last confirmed location is the residence. The last reliable time frame is a holiday night when neighbors are least attentive and routines are most elastic. Experienced investigators know that cases like this rise or fall on verifiable points: who was in the home, who left, what moved, what didn't, and whether the physical space yields contradictions under scrutiny. In other words, before theory, evidence. Relatives describe Susan as engaged with day-to-day obligations, not planning to vanish, not preparing her son for relocation. Evan's world reflects a teenager's structure: school, summer rhythms, friends. That scaffold disappears in one stroke. If either had chosen to leave, they left without the tools most people choose: phones that transmit, cards that purchase, cars that travel. That contradiction becomes the working thesis for the opening phase of the investigation. If the data says they didn't move, then the home and its immediate perimeter hold the first answers. The point of view here is sober and procedural. What is documented? 2 names, 1 residence, a fixed last seen date, a total drop in digital and financial activity. What is not documented? Any verified sighting after Memorial Day, any message from either missing person, any legitimate transaction that suggests life continued somewhere else. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. Communities like Holtville feel cases like this in the small spaces: empty seats at church, a mailbox that stops opening, a yard that looks the same until someone notices it doesn't. We'll stay out of speculation and work the sequence the way detectives do: secure your anchors, test each object that changed, and account for every absence. There is no shortcut, there is only the chain. The next anchor is the residence. After May 29, 2017, the home in Holtville/Wetumpka does not look the same. Fresh paint appears on interior walls. Flooring changes. Neighbors notice smoke from a backyard burn. A new camera system replaces the old one within days. None of those acts, by themselves, prove a crime. Together, they form the first measurable shift in the case record. The environment changes before there's any verified sign that Susan Osborne or her son, Evan Chartrand, changed theirs. Detectives start with what can be confirmed, not what can be inferred. They log receipts and service calls tied to paint, flooring, and surveillance equipment. Dates matter. If materials are purchased or installed immediately after the last reliable sighting, that timing becomes part of the investigative picture. It doesn't assign motive, it defines opportunity. In missing person work tied to a private residence, any rapid interior update is treated as potential context, something that could mask ordinary wear, or something that could overwrite relevant traces. The point is not to leap ahead, the point is to fix the order of events so the rest of the case has a spine. Neighbors give consistent observations about burning in the yard. Officers record where the burn occurred and whether anything recognizable remains: metal hardware, fasteners, fragments that resist heat. If there's nothing identifiable, the log still matters: date, time, description, and who saw it. In towns like Holtville, everyday routines are noticed. A burn pile on the heels of a disappearance will always draw a line in a case file, even if the line is just, note the fire. Note the date. The new camera system is its own problem. When surveillance changes right after people go missing, investigators ask two questions: what did the old system record, and what does the new one omit? If the previous hardware and storage are gone, that gap is documented. If the new install removes coverage on a door or a yard, that's documented too. The goal is not to argue why the change happened, the goal is to show that it did, and when. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. Inside the house, investigators follow a simple path: what's newly painted, what's newly covered, and what's newly missing. Paint alone is not suspicious. Carpet changes alone are not suspicious. But the cluster of changes, tied to a specific week, is the kind of cluster that pushes a case forward. If a room shows clear demarcation, fresh paint stopping at a trim line, new flooring installed only in selected zones, those edges become search areas. If nothing probative is found, the report will say so plainly. That clarity is part of the job. A negative result still narrows the map. Friends describe a home that should have looked lived in by a mother and a teenage son. Investigators take a quiet inventory: clothing left behind, school items in place, medication status, toiletries, mail. They look for signs of a planned transition: packed bags, labeled storage, forwarding orders. The house does not show that kind of organization. It shows a reset. A reset is different. It's not the outward churn of a family preparing to move, it's the inward clearing of a space that keeps the same address but erases signs of the people who used it last. Viewers often ask why officers don't call a scene a crime scene on day one. The answer is legal and practical. A house only becomes a homicide scene when the evidence supports that designation. Until then, the residence is a potential source of trace evidence, and every action must preserve options. That's why the language here stays precise. The case does not have bodies. It does not have a confession. It has a sequence of changes that start at the one place we know for sure Susan and Evan used, their home. When a mother and her son vanish and the home turns over in days, paint, floors, cameras, burn, that is not proof. It is priority. There is a human layer beneath the logs. Families recognize the smell of a place. They know where photographs hung and where a backpack usually sits. When they walk in and the space is new, it hits. We keep that reaction short here because the work has to stay focused, but it matters. Missing person cases are not solved by speeches. They are solved by the right timestamp, the right edge of a floorboard, the right neighbor memory captured before it fades. The case moves on the smallest clock in the house, the pets. In families, animals are routine made visible: walks, food, vet reminders, a water bowl that needs filling twice a day. When those routines stop, investigators get a hard timestamp that isn't based on memory. In Holtville/Wetumpka, the record shows 2 dogs from Susan Osborne's home were surrendered to a local shelter on June 12, 2017, less than 2 weeks after Memorial Day. That single date changes the risk profile. People who choose to disappear rarely hand off pets to a shelter that way and then leave no trail at all. It doesn't prove what happened to Susan and her son, Evan Chartrand. It proves the house was still making decisions. Detectives start with paperwork. Shelters track intakes, date, time, condition, whether the animals are microchipped, and who brought them in. Even when a name isn't confirmed, there may be a vehicle description, a receipt, a signature, or surveillance at the lobby. In a small town, staff may remember the drop. Investigators ask the same set of questions every time. Were the dogs presented as strays or owner surrenders? Were they identified as belonging to Susan? Were any personal items left with them, leashes, collars with tags, vaccination records? Those details matter because they show intent. An owner who is about to move typically arranges fosters, friends, or family. A person framing a short absence often leaves food and a plan. A clean surrender without a long-term care plan, days after a mother and son go silent, is a different signal. The pets also anchor the home supply chain. Officers compare shelter dates against purchases of dog food, heartworm meds, flea treatments, and vet visits. If those purchases stop cold before June 12th, the stop aligns with a planned handoff. If the purchases continue after the surrender, that misalignment says the story of "they left, I adjusted" needs to be checked. It's basic, and it's effective. Cases like this hinge less on dramatic moments and more on whether the receipts make sense when you lay them on a calendar. Neighbors add context. In the weeks around June 12th, were the dogs seen in the yard or the house? Did barking stop abruptly or taper off? Did anyone observe someone loading the animals into a vehicle? These aren't curiosities, they are checks against the shelter record. If a neighbor last saw the dogs on June 10th and the shelter logged them on June 12th, the timeline is tight and credible. If a neighbor swears they saw the dogs a week later, then the paperwork, the memory, or the identification is off, and investigators need to resolve which. The emotional piece is simple and it belongs here. Pets are family. Viewers know that. Investigators know it too, and they try not to lean on it, because the work has to stay clean. But when a mother and a teenager vanish and their dogs are turned over, it shifts the odds. Voluntary disappearance without money, without phones, and without pets is statistically rare. It's not proof of harm. It's pressure on the theory that they chose to go. Back inside the house, the pet timeline connects to the physical changes already logged. If the dogs left on June 12th, what was happening in the residence between May 29th and that date? New paint, flooring replacements, and a new camera system have already been documented as occurring in that same window. That alignment is what concerns detectives, the convergence of unrelated housekeeping items with the decision to remove the animals. You don't have to argue why, you only have to show that all three things happened within days of each other while Susan and Evan made no calls, spent no money, and created no sightings. Legally, precision matters. The residence is not declared a homicide scene. The dog surrender does not make it one. It does, however, narrow the investigative map. If the pets were removed, the house could be cleared for extended periods without noise complaints or welfare checks triggered by barking. That gives time for repairs, cleaning, or simply a reset that reduces the normal signs of life. Cases can turn on that kind of logistical quiet. There is also the possibility of a cover story. Surrender forms sometimes list vague reasons: moving, allergies, no time. Detectives compare those stated reasons to verifiable facts. Did anyone close to Susan hear she was moving and accepting help to rehome? Did school records reflect an upcoming change for Evan? Did family receive any message requesting assistance with the dogs? The more those answers land on no, the more the June 12th entry stands alone as an action taken inside a vacuum. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. The community layer stays measured. People in small towns understand the weight of a pet at the door waiting for an owner who doesn't return. That's not sentimentality, it's another form of evidence, behavior. Animals that are routinely walked and fed don't get abandoned without someone making a choice. The report will not guess at motivation. It will say this: by June 12th, the house had no pets, and by that date there was still no verified trace of Susan or Evan. From an investigative standpoint, that is not an ending. It is the strongest midpoint the case has. The next step is a calendar, not a hunch. Investigators locked the review window from the night of May 29th through June 12th, 2017, the same period when the house changed and the dogs were surrendered. Subpoenas go out in a standard sequence: banks, credit issuers, mobile carriers, and the service accounts that tend to leave small fingerprints, email access, cloud logins, app purchases. The result that comes back isn't dramatic, it's consistent. There is no confirmed spending by Susan Osborne in that window. No card swipes that place her at a store or gas pump. No withdrawals that put her at an ATM. Her regular communications show no calls or texts that land after Memorial Day. The same applies to Evan Chartrand. The quiet is complete. Silence like this is not read emotionally, it's read against pattern. Most adults touch money every few days: groceries, fuel, small charges that add up. Parents of teens tend to ping across platforms even in a slow week. When a mother and a teenager both stop generating basic activity, the working assumption becomes very narrow: if they moved, they did it without phones, without cards, and without trace. That doesn't line up with ordinary life. It also doesn't match a planned relocation. Moves create receipts. This window creates none. The audit checks for small leaks that often betray big stories. If someone else is using their accounts, failed logins and password resets usually leave marks. If someone tries to take over a phone, the carrier records SIM changes and device swaps. If anyone runs a card, even once, a merchant ID lands on the statement. None of that appears. The file doesn't say why. It says what? The people whose names are on the missing person report do not generate digital or financial movement after the date they're last reliably placed at home. That matters because of what did move: things inside the residence and, 12 days later, the pets. You can change flooring and paint without logging anything, but replacing a camera system generates an invoice, and surrendering dogs creates a timestamp. Those actions exist on paper. In contrast, nothing owned by Susan or Evan pushes a signal outward in the same time frame. A clean separation appears, house decisions continue, their lives do not. The point isn't to declare a conclusion, the point is to fix the contrast so it can't drift later. Detectives run a second pass for recurring items. People who vanish sometimes leave behind autopays that continue: utilities, streaming, phone plans. Those aren't evidence of life, they're evidence of billing. So the team strips those away and looks for discretionary decisions: fuel, food, pharmacy, travel, school-related expenses. When the ledger is still empty, the finding doesn't become proof of harm. It becomes a barrier to any theory that requires the missing to be active somewhere else. In real work, that's progress. Phones get extra attention. Even when texts stop, many devices produce routine handshakes with the network. If the carriers report no calls or texts, and there's no indication of device movement that points to travel, the map doesn't expand. Investigators will sometimes canvass towers for anomalies in a small radius if they think the devices may have powered on locally. If nothing useful surfaces, the report says so and moves forward. You don't build suspense in a file, you build certainty about what isn't true. There is a human read on this, kept brief. When families search, they look for choices their people would make if they were free to choose. A mother who intends to leave will usually signal something to someone: arrange a ride, stash cash, or at least decide how her son will eat the next day. A 14-year-old's life has anchors that are hard to hide: friends, games, summer plans, the next text. When none of that fires, the conversation shifts from where did they go to who was still making decisions around them. It is not a verdict. It is a correction in focus. The 5-minute mark of any good true crime story should earn the audience's trust. Here's what's earned: a stable timeline and a void that isn't rhetorical. By June 12th, the home has no pets. By that date, neither Susan nor Evan has created a footprint on money or phones. The case does not gain a body. The case gains a window where actions are documented at the residence while the people tied to those actions are not documented anywhere. Viewers understand that difference. Detectives rely on it. A final note on scope: this review sticks to the confirmed window and doesn't assume events outside it. If later records extend the quiet beyond June 12th, the narrative will adopt them. If the accounts wake up legitimately under their names, that would change the case. As of this point in 2017, and as we sit in November 2025, the public record still supports one simple line: no verified movement by the missing after Memorial Day. When a disappearance starts at home, the first story offered about where people went becomes a piece of evidence. In Holtville/Wetumpka, the early explanation was simple: Susan Osborne left with a man. Later, that same man returned to collect belongings. On its face, the claim points outward: two people drive away, then one comes back. But explanations are tested, not adopted. Detectives pinned the story to the calendar already established: last reliable placement on May 29, 2017, a run of interior changes inside the house in the days that followed. The dog surrendered on June 12th. Then they asked the only question that matters at this stage: what can be verified against those dates? They started with vehicles. A departure with another adult usually leaves a trace. Neighbors see a car that isn't familiar, a driveway camera captures headlights, a license plate reader on a nearby road picks up a pass. If a specific man returned to move items, there should be another imprint, a car parked at the residence long enough to load, or at least additional trips close together. The public record does not document any corroboration of those movements. That doesn't prove the explanation is false. It establishes that the version of events offered to family and investigators isn't supported by independent, timestamped sources in the window that matters most. Inside the residence, officers looked for the normal signatures of a move executed by someone other than the occupant: boxes, plastic bins, labels, a clear area by a door used to stage items, fresh scrapes at thresholds, boot prints and dust that don't match the typical patterns. If a third party returned to gather belongings, there is usually some evidence of staging or traffic. The file language stays careful: what could be documented is recorded, what couldn't be verified is not dressed up. The house shows changes, it does not show a documented move out by a named outsider within days of May 29th. They also work backward from practical needs. A person who escorts a mother and a teenager away usually intersects their lives before that night: calls, messages, a pickup arrangement. Detectives checked for any contact consistent with that plan. The communications audit already established a stop after Memorial Day. There is no verified call or text from Susan or from her son, Evan Chartrand, that would reasonably set up a clean exit. If someone else handled the logistics on their behalf, there should be some collateral trace: another phone interacting with theirs, a rideshare record, at minimum a credible sighting. None appears in the open source or public reporting. Again, that absence is not presented as a verdict. It's a gap that the offered story fails to close. The claim that he came back to move things was tested the same way. Detectives checked with family and close friends. Did anyone receive a message authorizing a pickup or explaining that property would be removed? Did anyone see a moving van, a trailer, or storage receipts? Was a bedroom dismantled in a way that fit a third-party pack-out? Investigations don't lean on how something feels. They look for paperwork and points of contact: leases, storage units, access logs, anything that backstops the narrative. If those points don't exist, the story loses weight. It doesn't vanish, it just can't carry the case forward. Neighbors gave observations about that stretch of early June. They noticed smoke from the backyard, they noticed interior changes, but no one reported a steady stream of movers or a parade of vehicles that would match an organized removal of a mother's and a teenager's possessions. In small communities, unusual activity is noticed, so is unusual quiet. The record around the house shows the latter more than the former. For investigators, that's a signal to stay focused on what the calendar already shows: a cluster of decisions affecting the environment, and no confirmable movement by the two people who are missing. There is a simple, human reason to handle this chapter carefully. Families faced with silence want an answer more than a theory. If there was a man and if he took them, he should show up somewhere else in the data: an apartment, a job site, a highway camera. If he returned to move belongings, there should be proof outside the house: warehouse entries, storage leases, even discarded packaging. An uncorroborated story does not mean nothing happened. It means the claim carries a burden of proof that hasn't been met. Responsible storytelling keeps that line bright for viewers and for the people who still wait for news. Legally, the phrasing matters. This investigation, as of November 2025, has not produced a body, a confession, or charges. It has a person publicly named as a person of interest. It has a house that changed. It has a pet handoff with a precise date, and it has an explanation that does not align with verifiable records. That is enough to guide the next moves. It is not enough to declare what happened to Susan and Evan. Before leaving this section, one more operational check closes the loop on the explanation: property inventories. When people leave with help, they usually take specific categories first: ID documents, prescriptions, school items, personal electronics. If those remain at the residence, it complicates any claim that the missing were safely relocated. If they're gone and it's provable, that helps the story. Where the record stays quiet, the narrative stays careful. Every step in this case is being tied back to the same date so that later chapters don't drift, and so you can see the exact reason one theory gets weaker while another draws focus, not because it sounds right, but because the calendar and the paper say so. A brief word on empathy, because it belongs in the room even when the tone is firm. Explanations can be offered in shock, confusion, or fear. Investigators know that. They are patient with the first version someone gives, but they still test it. The work honors families not with certainty we don't have, but with clarity we can prove. When detectives re-entered the Holtville/Wetumpka residence as a potential source of trace evidence, they worked room by room, not theory first. The aim was narrow: identify anything that could place Susan Osborne or Evan Chartrand inside the house after Memorial Day, or point to a transfer of biological material that suggested injury. Areas touched by recent changes, fresh paint lines, replaced flooring, and zones near doorways were prioritized because timing matters. That choice didn't label the home a homicide scene. It treated it as the most logical place to test the calendar we've already built. Collection came before interpretation. Technicians photographed surfaces as found, logged swabs, and lifted small samples from specific, pre-marked locations. Items with potential biological residues were packaged, sealed, and documented through chain of custody. The language in reports like these stays plain: location, sample number, who handled what, and when it moved to a lab. In cases where a room had clearly been updated, edges and seams received extra attention. It wasn't the cosmetic change itself that mattered, it was whether those edges still held usable material once documented. Preliminary screening only tells you whether a sample might be biological. It does not identify a person, and it does not tell a story. Any positives were forwarded for more advanced work. On public record, investigators have acknowledged the presence of suspected blood traces inside the residence tied to testing. They also said what those traces were not. They weren't enough to close the case. That finding is not a failure. It sets a ceiling on what the house can prove and a floor under what cannot be argued later. If a case eventually goes to court, this precision matters as much as a major hit. Objects were handled the same way. Technicians examined cut points where flooring had been changed, looking for transfer, fibers, or residues caught under trim. They logged cleaning supplies if present, not as accusation but as context for whether a surface might be degraded. Those notations help explain negative results later and protect the integrity of the process. If you can't get a full profile, the file should say why: because there wasn't enough material, because it degraded, or because the signal could not be associated with a known person on record. The house did not deliver a definitive answer, it delivered a series of boundaries. If a trace indicated biological material in one location but failed to rise to a conclusive match, that still informed strategy. It told detectives which rooms deserved re-examination, whether drains or traps should be checked, and whether the absence of a result was due to time, materials, or post-event changes. Each answer, even the negative ones, narrowed what the explanation could reasonably be. Evidence collection is not a monologue, it's a map that gets redrawn until only one path still fits the dates. Communication to family and the public stayed careful and consistent. Authorities confirmed the search, confirmed that testing occurred, and confirmed that the results were insufficient to make a final determination. No bodies. No charges. No step beyond what the lab could support. That restraint can frustrate viewers who want a reveal in the middle. But in real cases, a clean record protects the truth later. You only step forward when the material supports it. There's a human reason the method matters. Families need to know that the house wasn't simply looked at. They need to hear that it was searched with a plan, documented without shortcuts, and tested against the very weeks when Susan and Evan stop appearing anywhere else. That confidence doesn't replace answers, but it prevents a second wound, one where doubts about the process become the story. Precision is a form of respect. By the time the collection and testing cycles ended, the case had learned two things that can coexist without contradiction. The residents produced indications that warranted lab work, and those indications did not resolve what happened to the missing. That outcome keeps the case open and keeps the search wider than the front door. It also preserves the single timeline we've established, no alternate ending shaped by wishful thinking, no promotion of the house to a crime scene when the record doesn't support it. The file stays disciplined so the next steps have someplace solid to stand. When the lab work from the residents came back as insufficient to conclude, the search didn't stop, it changed direction. Detectives shifted outside, building target zones from the dates already locked. Last reliable presence on May 29th, the quiet that followed, and the June 12th pet surrender. The plan was practical: define where a vehicle could go without drawing attention, identify spots that keep secrets longer than sidewalks do, and work outward with consistency instead of speculation. They began with drive time rings. In rural Alabama, 10 to 30 minutes can mean creeks, timber edges, and pull-offs that don't see traffic after dark. Investigators overlaid those rings with simple questions: which roads could be used without passing a camera? Which pullouts are shielded from a house across the road? Which water access points allow a stop without headlights aimed at a front porch? The aim wasn't drama, it was coverage. Teams walked shoulders, photographed culverts, and checked low banks where disturbed soil shows longer than on open ground. Canvassing restarted with a narrower script. Stores that operate late were asked for any transactions or footage that matched the window, not to prove who was missing but to prove where a vehicle did, or did not, stop. Gas stations within the first ring were prioritized. If there's no verified card activity from Susan Osborne after Memorial Day, then a cash purchase might be the only marker left. Even a negative, no sales that fit, has value when you stack enough of them. It clears a route from the map. Trash and service logs drew attention next. Rural pickup schedules and local disposal sites create a rhythm that people forget until the routine changes. Investigators checked for extra loads, off-schedule dumps, or work orders in that 2-week span. The request wasn't an accusation. It was a timeline test. If materials left the residence during the quiet period, where could they have gone without anyone noticing? Small-town providers often remember unusual requests. When they don't, the dated log still answers whether a truck stopped where it usually doesn't. Searchers also revisited the area near the reported backyard burn, not to relitigate the house but to follow the logic outward. Soil screening moved beyond the property boundary to places an ash load might be shaken off, trailheads, field entrances, or gravel lanes where debris falls from a truck bed. When nothing probative surfaced, that outcome was recorded in plain language. A negative result is not a dead end, it's a reason to stop burning hours on a theory that isn't paying out. Tip flow was managed more tightly. Leads that fit the calendar were elevated, stories that floated months away from the anchor dates were parked unless they carried verifiable markers. Relatives were briefed with the same clarity: what was searched, why it was searched, and what the next pass would target. That consistency matters. Families don't need a tour of tactics, they need assurance that the investigation is moving somewhere new on purpose. There was a small but meaningful shift in tone at this stage. The case stopped asking where Susan and Evan Chartrand might have chosen to go and started asking where a driver could operate without leaving a mark. That isn't a presumption of harm. It's the next responsible question when phones, cards, and sightings are silent. Tight canvases produce fewer surprises later. They also earn public trust. In towns like Holtville and Wetumpka, that trust keeps tips coming when the story has gone quiet in the news. By the end of this phase, the file had more cleared ground than breakthroughs, and that's honest work. Several water access points were logged and dismissed, late-hour retailers in the first ring were checked and closed out, and no on-the-record surveillance placed the missing beyond the home after Memorial Day. It keeps the case single-threaded, one timeline, one geography, one unanswered question that isn't being stretched to fit a theory. The investigation ended where phones and bank logs can't help. Who could move a vehicle from this address without being logged, and what paper exists in the world that isn't digital, storage slips, hauling receipts, postal changes, that might show a move anyway. The goal was simple and narrow. Keep the case inside the dates we've already fixed. Last reliable placement at home on May 29, 2017, dogs surrendered on June 12, 2017, and test only what can be verified. Access came first. Detectives listed every vehicle tied to the Holtville/Wetumpka residence and everyone with keys or routine permission to enter the drive. They checked service bays for early June work, tire patches, alignment resets, fluid changes, because a bay ticket prints a date even if someone pays in cash. They studied the physical layout, which side entries allow a car to leave without throwing light toward a neighbor, which routes split the field of nearby cameras, which gravel cut-throughs bypass the most obvious intersections. This was not theory. It was a practical map of how a driver could operate unseen within a 30-minute ring. From there the work shifted to analog trails that outlast memory. Storage yards were asked for units opened on short notice in early June 2017, especially cash rentals that opened and closed inside the same month. Gate systems log keypad entries and often snap a plate or bumper as a vehicle noses in. Independent haulers and small disposal services were queried for off-route pickups, tarped loads, or unusual early morning runs in that same window. Operators who work a county tend to remember the odd jobs. When they don't, dated route sheets answer whether a truck went where it usually doesn't. The postal check was just as blunt, forwarding orders, change of address cards, or mail holds that match a planned relocation. Moves create paperwork. If the paperwork isn't there, the theory carrying it gets lighter. None of those checks asked the public to guess intent. They asked for receipts, logs, and camera frames. If a vehicle tied to the residence passed a first-ring gas lob without buying, a wide lens might still catch a timestamp. If a short-term storage unit took a cash deposit and closed inside the month, the ledger would show the open and the close. If a driver hired help to move anything bulky, a carbon copy might still sit in a glove box or a vendor's file. When those points of proof don't appear, the case accepts the negative as part of the record and moves on. By design, this phase did not relitigate the house, the paint, the flooring, the backyard burn, or the lab result that followed. Those are already anchored. This phase pressed the routes a quiet driver would need if the early explanation, leaving with another adult and then coming back for belongings, were true. The outcome is consistent with everything you've heard. As of November 6, 2025, there is no on-the-record license plate hit, no documented short-term storage lease, no verified off-route haul, and no postal change that places Susan Osborne, 42, or Evan Chartrand, 14, anywhere beyond the Holtville/Wetumpka home after Memorial Day 2017. The case remains open. One person has been publicly identified by authorities as a person of interest. No one has been charged. There is a human line worth stating, briefly. Good searches don't only look for what hurts, they look for what would make a safe choice visible. A mother who intends to relocate with a teenager leaves durable signs, school arrangements, a friend who helped, a mailbox that starts forwarding, a unit that opens to hold boxes. 8 years in, those signs have not surfaced on the public record. That does not grant anyone guilt. It reinforces why the timeline stays exact and why the asks to viewers stay specific. So the file closes this arc the only responsible way, with a single thread and a narrow request. If you lived or worked inside a 30-minute drive of Holtville/Wetumpka in early June 2017 and handled short-notice storage, independent hauling, or private exterior camera systems pointed at roads or lots, your dated paperwork or archived footage could matter. One receipt, one DVR clip, one gate snapshot that matches that 2-week window is the kind of proof that moves a case that has refused to move. As your narrator, here's my takeaway. Cases like Susan and Evan remind me to trust small facts, check on loved ones, and act when silence shows up. Document, call, keep a record. Community attention moves stalled files. Your tip can matter more than any theory. In your town, what simple habit will you adopt? Saving exterior footage, noting plate numbers, organizing neighbors. If this story reached you, tell me where you're watching from or why it didn't work for you. If you want clear, humane true crime told with respect, please subscribe to the channel.